A wealthy man traps his 4-year-old daughter in a lion maze. But this horse saw everything. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The scream echoed through the chilly Alabama night like a lost lament among the trees of the estate. Lily, just 4 years old, felt her tiny hands tremble as her father dragged her by the hair across the uneven ground. Tears blurred her vision, but she could make out the tall fences rising before her like dark walls under the pale moonlight. Eleanor Elliott Damasceno, at 52, had built an empire in the Alabama agricultural business through methods that few dared to question. His calloused hands, which had signed dubious contracts and closed deals that exploited farm workers, now brutally gripped his own daughter's arm. His eyes, once calculating in business, gleamed with a fury that seemed to consume any trace of humanity left in his soul. The 37-acre property housed more than cattle and crops. Elliott maintained a collection of exotic animals there as a symbol of his status in the region. Among them were 2 adult lions he had acquired from a failing circus through questionable means, and a 5-year-old white horse named Snow, whose eyes showed unusual intelligence and a naturally protective temperament. That night, something had definitively broken in Elliott's mind. The documents his wife had left behind before departing this world still burned in his memory like incandescent coals. Papers that could destroy his businesses, evidence of his illegal practices in land speculation, fraudulent contracts involving local authorities. And Lily, with her golden hair and blue eyes, was the living image of the woman who had betrayed him with that cursed inheritance. The little girl stumbled, her bare feet finding sharp stones in the path. Her pink dress, which had been clean and fragrant in the morning, was now torn and dirty with earth. She did not understand why her father, who had always been distant, but never violent, now treated her as if she were his greatest enemy. The maze opened before them like a hungry mouth. Elliott had built that structure years before, initially as an eccentric landscaping project, but which now revealed its true sinister nature. 8-foot-high fences formed narrow corridors and paths that forked in all directions, creating a true puzzle of wood and barbed wire. Lily could hear the low roars coming from inside the structure. The lions, Fernando and Beatrice, 8 and 6 years old respectively, had been released inside 2 hours earlier. Their predatory instincts were sharpened by the controlled hunger that Elliott had imposed in recent days, part of his meticulously cruel plan. As father and daughter approached the entrance to the maze, Snow watched everything from his pasture about 200 yards away. The horse, who had developed a special bond with the little girl over the previous months, sensed something wrong in the air. His nostrils flared, catching the scent of fear, despair, impending violence. His muscles contracted under his white coat, and his hooves scraped the ground with growing agitation. Elliott stopped at the entrance to the maze, his hand still holding Lily tightly. The girl looked up, trying to find in her father's eyes some sign of the man who had raised her, but found only a stranger with his face contorted by anger and something much worse that she could not understand. For a few seconds, father and daughter remained there, a terrible tableau under the stars of rural Alabama. The night wind carried the scent of apple orchards and cornfields, cruelly contrasting with the nightmarish atmosphere unfolding on that isolated property. Then, with an abrupt movement that made Lily stumble and fall to her knees, Elliott pushed her into the maze. The iron gate slammed shut behind her with a crash that echoed through the night, followed by the dry sound of the key turning in the lock. The girl rose slowly, her wobbly legs supporting her small, trembling body. Before her stretched a narrow corridor, flanked by tall fences that blocked her view of the outside world. The ground was packed earth, dotted here and there with small stones and dry branches. In the distance, the roar of one of the lions cut through the silence, closer than she would have liked. Lily took her first hesitant steps down the corridor, her small hands touching the fences in search of some opening, some way to escape this nightmare. But the woods were firmly fixed, and the barbed wire at the top prevented her from trying to climb. Outside, snow had begun to move. The horse walked in circles in his pasture, his agitation growing with each passing moment. He could hear the sounds coming from the maze, could feel the girl's terror, as if it were a tangible force in the air. His protective instincts, refined by millennia of evolution, screamed for him to act. The first fork in the maze presented itself to Lily as an impossible choice, to the left or to the right. She had no way of knowing which path would lead her away from danger, which would lead her back home, which would lead her directly to the predators her father had unleashed as her executioners. Meanwhile, in the main house, Benedita Benny Santos, 67, awoke from her light sleep. The housekeeper, who had worked for the family for decades, had the sleep of someone who had learned to be always alert to the needs of her employers. Something had awakened her, a sound she could not identify, but that made her heart race with inexplicable anxiety. She rose from her simple bed in the back room of the house, her bare feet touching the cold tile floor. Benny knew every sound of that property, every groan of the old wood, every whisper of the wind in the trees. But what she had heard was different, charged with an urgency that made her tremble. Walking to the window, she pulled back the chintz curtain and looked towards the maze. The structure loomed like a sinister shadow against the starry sky, and, for a moment, she thought she saw movement nearby. Her maternal heart, developed over decades of caring for Lily as if she were her own granddaughter, whispered that something terrible was happening. In the maze, Lily had chosen the path to the right, her small hands still touching the fences as she moved forward. Each step was a victory against the paralyzing fear, each breath a fight against the panic that threatened to consume her completely. She could hear her own accelerated breathing, the sound of her bare feet on the earth, and in the distance, always in the distance, the roars that seemed to be getting closer and closer. It was then that she heard something different, a sound that made her heart leap with desperate hope. It was the neighing of a horse, loud and clear, cutting through the night like a war cry. Snow had broken through the fences of his pasture. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the property like dry thunder. Snow had charged against the fences of his pasture with desperate force, his powerful hooves shattering the old boards that held him confined. Pieces of wood flew through the air as the white horse freed himself, his heaving chest gleaming under the pale moonlight. Inside the maze, Lily stopped walking when she heard the noise. Her tears had left dirty streaks on her rosy cheeks, and her lips trembled as much from cold as from fear. The pink dress was now completely torn at the knees, and small scratches marked her thin legs where the barbed wire had touched her delicate skin. The roar of Fernando cut through the air, closer this time. The male lion, with his 8 years and golden mane, had caught the scent of the child. His yellow eyes glowed in the darkness as he moved through the corridors of the maze with the calculated patience of an experienced predator. The controlled hunger of recent days had sharpened his instincts, turning him into a lethal hunting machine. Benny ran through the hallway of the main house, her bare feet making noise against the cold tile floor. Her white cotton nightgown billowed. As she headed to Lily's room, a terrible premonition growing in her chest like a shadow that spread. Her 67 years weighed on her aching joints, but the maternal love she felt for the girl gave her strength to ignore any discomfort. The bedroom door was ajar. Benny pushed it open slowly, hoping to find the child sleeping in her small bed, decorated with stuffed teddy bears. But the bed was empty, the sheets still arranged from the previous morning. The housekeeper's heart leaped, and she felt her hands trembling as she turned on the light. The room showed signs of a struggle. Some toys were scattered on the floor irregularly. The small chair next to the bed had fallen over, and one of the curtains was partially torn. Benny approached the window and looked out, her eyes searching desperately for any sign of the girl. It was then that she saw Elliot walking back to the house, his clothes disheveled and his hands dirty with earth. There was something in his posture, in his movements, that made Benny's stomach clench with horror. She had known that man for decades, had seen his gradual transformation from an ambitious young man into an unscrupulous businessman, but had never witnessed the expression that now marked his face. Snow galloped across the property towards the maze, his hooves pounding against the dry ground with an urgent rhythm. The horse had developed a special connection with Lily over the previous months. The girl used to visit him every day, bringing pieces of sugar and talking to him in her childlike language. Snow had learned to recognize her footsteps, her scent, even her mood by the subtle changes in her voice. Now every fiber of his animal being screamed that she was in mortal danger. Inside the maze, Lily had reached another fork. This time, 3 paths opened before her like dark mouths ready to devour her. She crouched on the ground, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small and invisible. Her muffled sobs echoed through the wooden fences, a broken and desperate sound that seemed even more tragic coming from someone so young. The scent of Fernando reached her before she could even see him. It was a strong, musky odor that made her nostrils burn and her stomach churn. The girl looked up and saw the lion's shadow moving in the corridor to her left, no more than 20 yards away. The predator had stopped, its massive head turned in her direction, its golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made Lily feel as if she were being weighed, measured, assessed. Fernando tilted his head, sniffing the air, confirming what his eyes had already detected. Lily tried to get up, but her legs seemed to have lost all their strength. She managed only to crawl a few yards across the dirt floor, leaving a trail of tears and terror behind her. Her small nails scratched the ground as she tried to get away from the predator, but each movement seemed only to draw more attention to her vulnerable presence. It was in this moment of absolute despair that the sound of Snow's hooves echoed through the maze. The horse had found one of the side entrances, a smaller opening that Elliot used for maintenance of the structure. Without hesitating, Snow forced his way through, his strong back pushing against the gate until the hinges gave way with a metallic groan. Fernando heard the noise and turned his head, his muscles tensing. The lion knew the horse by sight, but they had never interacted directly. Now, something in the sound of the hooves, in the urgency of Snow's movements, made the predator hesitate. His instincts told him that a new variable had entered the hunting equation. Benny ran downstairs, reaching the main room just as Elliot entered through the front door. The man stopped when he saw her, and for a moment their eyes met in a silence charged with tension. She could see dirt under his nails, sweat on his forehead, and something else that made her recoil instinctively. "Where's Lily?" The question came from her lips as a hoarse whisper, but charged with all the force of a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for that child. Elliot stared at her for a long moment, his eyes calculating, weighing his words. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded strangely calm, almost casual. "The girl ran away. Must have left during the night." "Ran away?" Benny felt the ground seem to shake beneath her feet. "Lily is 4 years old, Mr. Damasceno. Where would a 4-year-old child run away to in the middle of the night?" The silence that followed was interrupted only by the distant sound of galloping hooves, and further away still, something that made Benny's blood run cold in her veins. A low, prolonged roar that cut through the night like a knife. Snow had located Lily by the sound of her sobs. The horse moved through the narrow corridors with difficulty, his body too large for those confined spaces, but his determination unwavering. He could smell the girl's fear, mixed with the more dangerous odor of the predators that surrounded her. When he finally found her, huddled against a fence in what seemed to be a dead end, Snow felt his heart race. The girl was in a deplorable state, her golden hair tangled, her dress torn, her eyes red from crying. But she was alive. Lily looked up when she heard the horse's steps and for a moment thought she was dreaming. Snow approached slowly, lowering his large head until his dark eyes were level with hers. The horse blew softly, a low and comforting sound that the girl had learned to associate with safety and affection. "Snow." Her voice came out as a broken thread, barely audible. The horse lowered himself further, allowing her to touch his soft muzzle. It was the first moment of relief Lily had felt since she had been dragged from her room. But the relief was short-lived. Fernando had followed the sound of the hooves and was now approaching their position. The lion moved with renewed caution, as the presence of the horse had completely changed the dynamics of the situation. It was no longer just a hunt simple against a defenseless prey. It was now a confrontation between predator and protector, with an innocent child at the center of a battle that would determine if she would see the sunrise. The confrontation unfolded in deadly silence. Fernando emerged from the shadows of the corridors like a golden ghost, his muscles rippling beneath his coat as his eyes fixed alternately on the horse and the child. Snow positioned himself between the predator and Lily, his body forming a protective barrier, his nostrils flared, catching every nuance of the approaching danger. The girl remained crouched behind the horse's legs, her small fingers gripping the white fur as if it were her only anchor to reality. She could feel the tension in the air, dense as fog, making each breath seem like a monumental effort. Her blue eyes, red from crying, watched the scene with the pure terror of a child who finally understood that her life hung by a thread. Fernando took a step forward, testing the determination of his opponent. His 8 years of life had taught him to assess threats, and that horse represented something he rarely faced: an animal willing to die to protect another. The lion tilted, his head studying Snow with the patience of an experienced strategist. Snow did not back down. His 5 years of life on the property had developed in him a courage that transcended his natural instincts for flight. He had witnessed Lily's kindness, her innocence, the way she treated him with genuine affection when everyone else saw him as just another animal in Elliot's collection. Now, every fiber of his being refused to abandon her. In the main house, the argument between Benny and Elliot had intensified. The housekeeper, with all her decades of experience caring for the family, could read the lies in her employer's eyes as if they were words written on paper. "You're lying," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Lily would never leave the house alone, especially at night. She's afraid of the dark." Elliot approached her, and Benny could see up close the signs of recent violence. There were scratches on his hands, dirt under his nails, and a dark stain on his shirt that appeared to be blood. Her maternal heart leaped and she felt her legs weaken. "Are you questioning my word?" Elliot's voice came out low, dangerous. "That girl has always been trouble, just like her mother. Maybe it's better this way." The words hit Benny like slaps. She had known Elliot's wife, had cared for her during pregnancy, had held Lily in her arms soon after birth. The idea that that man could refer to his own daughter with such coldness made something break inside her chest. Outside, a roar cut through the early morning. It wasn't Fernando. It was Beatrice. The 6-year-old lioness had located the commotion and was approaching from the opposite side of the maze, her steps silent on the packed earth. Unlike her companion, Beatrice was more impulsive, more inclined to attack first and assess later. Lily heard the sound and shrank even further against Snow. The horse also perceived the new threat, his head turning rapidly between the two possible directions of attack. His muscles contracted, preparing for a battle he knew was unequal. It was in this moment of absolute tension that something unexpected happened. A gust of strong wind swept through the maze, bringing with it the scent of the region's cornfields and apple orchards. But it also brought something else, the scent of other humans. Theodore Ted Mendes, a 45-year-old veterinarian, had arrived at the property for a routine visit scheduled for the next day. However, his concern for some of Elliot's exotic animals had made him decide to arrive earlier. Parking his pickup truck at the entrance to the property, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. The sounds coming from the direction of the maze were not normal. Ted knew the roars of Fernando and Beatrice, having treated both lions when they arrived at the property months before. But there was something different in those sounds, an urgency, an aggressiveness that did not match the feline's usual behavior. Getting out of the vehicle, Ted grabbed his flashlight and headed in the direction of the noises. His decades of experience dealing with wild animals had taught him to interpret signs of danger, and all his instincts screamed that a tragedy was unfolding. Inside the maze, Fernando had made his decision. The lion crouched down, preparing for the leap that would put an end to that strange situation. His muscles contracted like springs about to be released, and Lily could see the mortal intent in his golden eyes. Snow also prepared himself. The horse knew he had no chance against two adult lions in direct combat, but he also knew he didn't need to win. He just needed to buy enough time for someone to find the child. He raised his front legs, a demonstration of strength that made Fernando hesitate for a fraction of a second. It was in that fraction of a second that Ted reached the maze. The light from his flashlight cut through the darkness like a sword, illuminating the terrible scene that was unfolding in the narrow corridors. The veterinarian immediately saw the situation: a terrified child protected by a brave horse, surrounded by two hungry predators in a confined space. "Jesus Christ," he murmured, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. Ted had witnessed many dangerous situations involving wild animals, but never something so clearly arranged to result in tragedy. Without hesitating, he began to shout, banging his flashlight against the metal fences. The noise echoed through the maze like an explosion, causing both Fernando and Beatrice to recoil momentarily. Lions raised in captivity retained an instinctive fear of loud and sudden noises, an ancestral reminder of the times when they were hunted. Lily looked up when she heard the human voice, and for the first time in hours felt a spark of hope shine in her chest. Snow also seemed to realize that the situation had changed, his body relaxing slightly without completely lowering his guard. Ted continued making noise as he moved around the outer perimeter of the maze, looking for an entrance. He knew the structure from having visited the property several times, but had never paid enough attention to memorize all the openings. In the house, Benny heard the shouts and knew immediately that her worst suspicions were confirmed. She turned to Elliot, who had paled upon hearing Ted's voice. "What have you done to that child?" The question came out as a desperate cry, charged with decades of maternal love and growing horror. Elliot stared at her with eyes that seemed to belong to a stranger. "She needs to learn, just like her mother needed to have learned." The words revealed the depth of the madness that had taken hold of the man. Benny understood at that moment that she was facing someone who had completely lost control, someone capable of any atrocity to satisfy his thirst for revenge against ghosts of the past. She ran towards the door, but Elliot grabbed her arm with brutal force. "You're not going anywhere." In the maze, Ted had finally found the main entrance. Seeing that it was locked, he did not hesitate to use his strength to break the lock with a large stone. The gate opened with a metallic groan, and he entered the narrow corridors with his flashlight as his only weapon. Fernando and Beatrice, disturbed by the constant noises and the presence of another human, began to retreat into the depths of the maze. Their instincts told them that the situation had become too complex, too dangerous to continue the hunt. Following the sounds of Lily's sobs, Ted navigated the confusing paths until he found the girl and the horse. The scene he found moved him deeply. A terrified but alive child, protected by an animal that had risked its own life for pure and simple love. "It's okay now," he said softly, reaching out to Lily. "I'm a friend. I've come to take you out of here." But when Lily looked at him, Ted saw something in her eyes that made him understand that that night had changed the girl forever. The trauma was etched in every line of her face, in every tremor of her small body. And when he picked her up in his arms, carrying her out of the maze with Snow following protectively beside them, Ted knew that the real battle was just beginning. Ted's veterinary clinic had never received such a desperate visit. The veterinarian drove in silence along the deserted roads of rural Alabama, his eyes alternating between the path ahead and the rearview mirror, where he could see Lily huddled in the back seat. The girl had not spoken a word since they left the property, her glazed eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the window. Benny had managed to escape from Elliot during the confusion and now occupied the passenger seat, her trembling hands holding a blanket she had grabbed in haste. Silent tears streamed down her wrinkled face as she watched the deplorable state of the child she had helped raise. Snow followed alongside the pickup, his heavy breathing forming small clouds of vapor. In the cold morning air, the horse had refused to stay behind, and Ted, understanding the special connection between the animal and the girl, had allowed him to accompany them. It was as if the horse knew that his mission of protection was far from over. At the clinic, Ted improvised a resting place for Lily in one of the smaller rooms, normally used for the recovery of small animals. He had not wanted to take her to a hospital, knowing that the inevitable questions about the circumstances of her condition could further complicate the situation. First, he needed to fully understand what had happened. Lily huddled in the corner of the improvised stretcher, her knees bent against her chest, hugging her own legs. Her pink dress was in tatters, stained with dirt and tears, and small cuts dotted her legs where the barbed wire had touched her skin. But it was the invisible wounds that worried Ted the most. The vacant look, the way she startled at any sudden movement, the absolute silence that had taken hold of her. Benny approached slowly, her movements calculated not to scare the girl. Even more. "Lily, honey, it's Grandma Benny. You're safe now." But Lily didn't respond. Her blue eyes, once bright with childlike curiosity, now seemed like two deep pools of trauma and confusion. She watched the adults around her with a mixture of fear and distrust that broke Benny's heart. Ted stepped aside for a private conversation with the housekeeper. "I need to know exactly what happened tonight. Every detail may be important to help this child." Benny told everything. Lily's disappearance, Elliot's lie about the alleged escape, the dirt under his nails, the coldness with which he had spoken about his own daughter. As she spoke, the horror of the situation became clearer, and Ted felt his indignation grow like a storm. "That man deliberately placed his daughter in the maze with the lions," he said, his voice low but charged with contained fury. "This wasn't an accident or a moment of anger. It was planned." Outside the clinic, Snow had positioned himself near the window of the room where Lily rested. The horse seemed to understand that even through the glass, his presence offered some comfort to the girl. His dark eyes remained alert, as if he still expected danger to appear at any moment. Meanwhile, on the farm, Elliot paced back and forth. In his living room, his mind working to create a version of events that would protect him. He had underestimated Ted and Benny, not expecting them to rescue Lily so quickly. Now he needed to prepare for the consequences. His hands trembled as he removed physical evidence of his involvement in the night's events. The key to the maze was thrown into an old well in the back of the property. The clothes soiled with earth were burned in a metal barrel, but he knew he couldn't erase the memories nor the psychological marks he had left on his daughter. Back at the clinic, Ted tried a different approach with Lily. He brought some simple toys from his office, small stuffed animals that he used to calm nervous animals. He placed them near the girl without forcing interaction, just offering options. Lily looked at the toys for a long moment. Her small hand reached out hesitantly towards a white stuffed horse, her fingers touching the soft material with a delicacy that contrasted tragically with the violence she had suffered. It was the first voluntary movement she had made since the rescue. Benny saw the gesture and felt a pang of hope. "She's always loved horses," she whispered to Ted. "Especially Snow. She used to spend hours talking to him." It was then that Ted had an idea. He left the room and returned a few minutes later, leading Snow by the rein. The horse had been washed quickly to remove the dirt and sweat from the night, and now entered the clinic with cautious steps, as if he knew he was in unfamiliar territory. Lily looked up when she saw Snow, and for the first time since the rescue, something akin to recognition shone in her gaze. The horse approached the stretcher, lowering his large head until it was level with the girl. His dark eyes met hers, and a silent communication was established between them. The girl reached out and touched Snow's muzzle. The horse remained perfectly still, allowing her to explore his face with small and trembling fingers. It was as if he understood that any sudden movement could break the fragile thread of trust that was being rebuilt. "Snow," she whispered, and it was the first word she had spoken since the rescue. Her voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. But for Benny and Ted, it was like hearing a symphony. The horse blew softly, a low and comforting sound that made Lily lean a little closer. For a few minutes, girl and horse remained like that, sharing a moment of peace amidst the chaos that their lives had become. But the peace was interrupted by the sound of tires on the gravel road outside. Ted looked out the window and saw the headlights of a car approaching. His heart leapt when he recognized the vehicle. It was Elliot's pickup truck. "He's come after her," Benny said, her voice filled with renewed panic. Ted acted quickly. He guided Snow and Lily into a more internal room of the clinic, away from the windows, while instructing Benny to lock all the doors. The veterinarian had dealt with problematic owners before, but never with someone clearly dangerous, as Elliot had revealed himself to be. Elliot got out of his pickup truck with calculated movements. He had brought a hunting shotgun, justifying to himself that he needed to protect his property from people who had kidnapped his daughter. In his distorted mind, he was the victim, and everyone else were criminals who had conspired against him. He banged on the door of the clinic with force, his fist making the glass tremble. "Ted, I know you're in there with my daughter. She belongs to me." Inside the clinic, Lily began to tremble violently when she heard her father's voice. Snow positioned himself between her and the door, his muscles tense, ready to defend the girl once again if necessary. The horse had recognized the voice and the sounds of hostility, and all his protective instincts were reactivated. Ted grabbed his phone, but hesitated before calling the police. In a small town like rural Alabama, the local authorities often had complicated connections with powerful men like Elliot. He couldn't be sure that the law would be on the side of justice. "Open this door, Ted, or I'll knock it." "Down!" Elliot's voice was becoming more desperate, more dangerous. It was then that Benny made a decision that would change everything. She took Ted's phone and dialed a number she knew by heart, not the police, but Father Michael, the most respected religious leader in the local community. If there was anyone in rural Alabama whose word carried enough weight to face Elliot Damasceno, it was the priest who had baptized half the town. Outside, Elliot checked his shotgun, preparing to do what he considered necessary to recover what was his. But he didn't know that his night of horror was only coming to an end. and that his downfall would be much more devastating than anything he could imagine. Father Michael arrived at the veterinary clinic, accompanied by 6 men from the community, including Joe Ferreira, the most respected merchant in town, and Tony Silva, whose lands bordered Elliot's property. Benny's desperate call had mobilized a network of protection that had existed for generations in rural Alabama, a silent chain of people who had known each other since childhood and who knew when something was deeply wrong. Elliot was still outside the clinic when the headlights of the cars illuminated the yard. His shotgun lowered slightly when he recognized the father, but his eyes remained wild, like those of a cornered animal that still believed it could fight to escape. "Elliot," Father Michael's voice cut through the night with serene authority, "put that gun down. We've come to talk." "They kidnapped my daughter!" Elliot shouted, but his voice no longer carried the same conviction as before. The presence of so many respected men from the community had planted a seed of doubt in his distorted mind. Joe Ferreira approached slowly, his hands visible, making no threatening movements. "Elliot, we've known each other for 20 years. You know I would never support something wrong. That girl needs medical care, not more violence." Inside the clinic, Lily had calmed down slightly with the arrival of the new voices. Snow remained close to her, his keen senses picking up the changes in the atmosphere outside. The horse seemed to understand that the danger was diminishing, but maintained his protective posture. Ted watched from the window while Benny continued beside the girl. The housekeeper had begun to sing a lullaby softly, the same one she used to soothe Lily when she was a baby. Her trembling but affectionate voice created a bubble of safety amidst the chaos. Father Michael continued his careful approach. "Son, look at your hands. Look at what you're doing. Is this what your wife would want to see? Is this how she would raise Lily?" The mention of his deceased wife hit Elliot like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, the fog of anger that clouded his mind dissipated enough for him to see the situation with terrible clarity. He was in front of a veterinary clinic, in the middle of the night, pointing a gun at people he had known for decades, all because of a 4-year-old child who was his own daughter. She looks so much like her mother," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Those blue eyes, always judging me, always knowing—" "Knowing what, Elliot?" Father Michael asked gently, but his question carried the weight of a confession that was being extracted. It was then that the truth began to come out, fragmented and confused, but revealing the depth of the guilt and hatred that had accumulated in Elliot's heart over the months. He spoke about the documents his wife had left behind, evidence of his questionable business practices. He spoke about how Lily constantly reminded him of his own moral corruption. And finally, he admitted what he had done that night. "I just wanted her to learn," he said, his shotgun now pointed at the ground, "that she would stop looking at me with those eyes that know too much." Tony Silva, who had remained silent until then, took a step forward. "Elliot, you put a 4-year-old child in a maze with hungry lions. You tried to kill your own daughter because of documents and memories." The word "kill" echoed in the night air like a sentence. For the first time, Elliot seemed to fully comprehend the enormity of what he had done. His shoulders slumped and the shotgun slipped from his hands, falling on the gravel floor with a metallic clang. Inside the clinic, Lily had fallen asleep, leaning against Snow. The horse remained motionless, allowing the girl to use his warm body as a pillow. It was the first time since the trauma that she had been able to relax enough to sleep, and Ted signaled Benny not to disturb her. "Father." Michael picked up Elliot's gun and handed it to Joe Ferreira. "Now let's go inside and see how the girl is doing. And you are going to ask that child for forgiveness for what you have done." But when they entered the clinic and Elliot saw Lily sleeping against Snow, something broke definitively inside him. The image of his daughter, so small and vulnerable, protected by an animal that had shown more compassion than he himself, was like looking in a mirror that reflected all his monstrosity. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he whispered, falling to his knees. "She should never forgive me." Ted approached, his professional anger contained in respect for the presence of the father. "Elliot, that child will need years of therapy to recover from what you have done. She may never completely trust adults again." "What happens now?" Benny asked, her voice laden with maternal concern. "Lily can't go back to that house." Father Michael looked around the group, weighing his words carefully. "Benny, would you be willing to take care of her, at least until we can make more permanent arrangements?" The housekeeper did not hesitate. "I would raise that girl as my own granddaughter. I've always loved her as if she were." "And Snow?" Ted asked, watching the horse that still protected the sleeping Lily. "It's obvious they have a special connection. Separating them now would be another trauma." Elliot looked up, and for the first time in hours, his voice came out without anger. "Snow is hers, always has been. I can sign the ownership papers. Benny can take them both." The weeks that followed brought drastic changes to the small community of rural Alabama. The story of what Elliot had done spread quickly, and the town's reaction was one of absolute horror and revulsion. His businesses began to crumble as business partners cancelled contracts, suppliers refused to work with him, and even the local bank began to review his loans. Lily went to live with Benny in a small but cozy house in the center of town. Snow was installed in a nearby pasture where the girl could visit him every day. Slowly, very slowly, she began to speak again, always first with the horse, then with Benny, and eventually with other people who demonstrated patience and kindness. Ted became a constant presence in their lives, visiting regularly to check on both Lily's physical and emotional health. He also cared for Snow, who had developed some problems in his hooves due to the stress of the night in the maze, but who was determined to recover completely. During those first months of recovery, Lily developed safety rituals. She needed to see Snow every morning before she could eat. She needed Benny to check all the doors and windows before going to sleep. She had frequent nightmares that made her wake up screaming, and only the presence of the horse could calm her completely. But there were signs of progress. Lily began to draw again, always white horses protecting small children. She began to help Benny in the kitchen, finding comfort in the simple and predictable tasks. And most importantly, she began to smile occasionally when Snow did something funny or when Benny told stories from when she was a baby. Elliot, meanwhile, had become a pariah in his own town. His employees abandoned him. His exotic animals were confiscated by environmental authorities who finally had the courage to act, and his farm began to deteriorate without proper maintenance. But the real justice was yet to come, because the documents his wife had left not only contained evidence of business corruption, they contained something much worse, something that was about to be discovered and that would destroy Elliot in a way he could never have imagined. The story was far from over, and fate had prepared a final twist that would prove that sometimes justice has its own way of manifesting itself. 6 months after that terrible night, Benny discovered the documents while organizing Lily's personal belongings that had been left on the farm. Hidden in a rag doll that the girl had received from her mother were papers that would reveal the full extent of Elliot Damasceno's wickedness. Ted was present when Benny opened the secret compartment in the doll. Her trembling fingers removed photographs, contracts, and handwritten notes that painted a terrifying picture. Elliot had not only exploited farm workers and speculated with lands, he had participated in a slave labor scheme that involved dozens of families in the region. "My God," Ted murmured as he examined the evidence. "These documents show that at least 15 people have disappeared on his lands in the last 5 years." The photographs revealed subhuman conditions on Elliot's remote farms, where workers were held against their will, their documents confiscated, their families threatened. Among the victims were 2 employees who had questioned his practices and simply disappeared one night, their bodies never found. Benny felt nausea grow in her stomach as the truth was revealed. "I worked for that monster for decades. How didn't I notice?" "Because he was smart," Ted replied grimly. "He kept those operations away from the main property, used foremen to do the dirty work. His wife must have discovered everything before she left." The documents included desperate notes from Lily's mother, revealing her plan to expose her husband to the authorities. She had gathered evidence for months, preparing to shatter Elliot's corrupt empire. But her fatal accident had interrupted those plans, leaving only the hidden documents as testimony to her courage. While the adults processed the shocking revelations, Lily played in the yard of Benny's house with Snow. The girl had made great progress in her recovery, although she still carried invisible scars from that night in the maze. She talked constantly to the horse, who remained patiently by her side, allowing her to brush his mane and share her most intimate thoughts. "Snow," she whispered, as she stroked his muzzle. "You will always protect me, won't you?" The horse blew, softly in response, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their new life. Ted had observed the relationship between girl and horse with professional and personal fascination. Snow demonstrated exceptional sensitivity to Lily's emotional states, positioning himself closer when she was sad, playing more when she needed. Distraction. Father Michael arrived at Benny's house that afternoon with serious news. The state authorities had finally decided to investigate Elliot after several families in the region began to report suspicious disappearances. The pressure from the local community, combined with the preliminary evidence that Ted had shared discreetly, had forced official action. "They will search the property tomorrow," the father informed. "And when they find what we know is there, Elliot will face consequences far beyond social ostracism." That night, as if sensing that his world was about to collapse completely, Elliot made a desperate decision. He had spent the last few months drinking excessively, isolated on his deteriorated property, ruminating about his fall from grace. The imminent arrival of the authorities pushed him beyond the limit of sanity. He decided to destroy all remaining evidence, including the very facilities where the crimes had occurred. He filled gallons of gasoline and began to set fire to the remote buildings on his property, not realizing that the strong wind that night would spread the flames far beyond his intentions. The fire spread quickly through the dry vegetation, creating a wall of fire that was heading dangerously towards neighboring properties. Tony Silver, whose lands bordered Elliot's, was the first to detect the fire and alert the neighbors. At Benny's house, the smell of smoke woke Lily in the middle of the night. The girl, still sensitive to anything that could represent danger, began to cry desperately. Snow, who was sleeping in the nearby pasture, also sensed the danger and began to neigh loudly, alerting the entire neighborhood. Ted arrived quickly to help with the evacuation. The fire had become an orange storm that consumed everything in its path, fueled by the dry winds of rural Alabama. The entire community mobilized to fight the flames and protect the threatened properties. It was during that chaotic night that final justice manifested itself in a way that no one could have predicted. Elliot, trying to escape his burning property, was trapped when a burning tree fell on his pickup truck, blocking his only route of escape. The same flames that he had lit to destroy evidence now surrounded him like a prison of fire. The volunteer firefighters from the region found Elliot 3 hours later, unconscious but alive, surrounded by the smoldering ruins of his empire. His burns were not fatal, but they were extensive enough to guarantee months of painful recovery. More importantly, all the physical evidence of his crimes had been destroyed by the flames, but the documents that his wife had hidden remained intact in Benny's house. When Elliot finally woke up in the regional hospital, it was to find state investigators waiting beside his bed. The documents recovered by Benny had provided more than enough evidence for multiple criminal charges. His desperate attempt to destroy evidence had only accelerated his own ruin. The months that followed brought a complete transformation for everyone involved. Elliot was sentenced to 30 years in prison for human trafficking, slave labor, and multiple other charges. His properties were confiscated by the state, with the resources being directed to a compensation fund for the families of the victims. Lily, now officially under Benny's guardianship, had transformed into a different child from what she was before that terrible night. She was more cautious, more observant, but also demonstrated impressive resilience. Her bond with Snow had deepened, and the horse had become not only her protector, but her best friend and confidant. Ted had become a father figure in the girl's life, visiting regularly and helping with the special care that both Lily and Snow needed. The veterinarian observed with admiration how the pair had recovered together, each offering strength to the other in difficult moments. The farm was transformed into a sanctuary for rescued animals, managed by a non-profit organization that Father Michael had helped to establish. The sinister maze was demolished, and in its place now grew a memorial garden for Elliot's victims. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, 1 year after the events that had changed their lives forever, Lily rode Snow for the first time. Benny and Ted watched with tears in their eyes as girl and horse moved in perfect harmony through the green field. "Snow," Lily said, her voice now strong and clear. "Thank you for saving me that night. Thank you for never leaving me alone." The horse neighed softly, as if he understood every word. And maybe he did, because in the end it had been pure love and unconditional loyalty that had triumphed over cruelty and abandonment. Elliot Damaschino had lost everything: his fortune, his freedom, his health, and any chance of redemption. But Lily and Snow had found something much more precious: a chosen family, built on genuine love and mutual protection. As the sun set over rural Alabama, painting the sky with gold and pink, the girl and her horse galloped towards the future, leaving behind the shadows of the past and embracing the promise of better days that were to come. The story of suffering had transformed into a story of hope, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, love and courage can prevail over evil and create something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy.